Test, test, test. This is a mic check. Testing 1, 2, 3. Test, test, test. Mic check. Test, test, test.
All right, we are going to go ahead and get started. My name is Dr. Nicholas Hudson, and I have the privilege and honor of serving as the Director of the Office of Student Orientation, Leadership, and Engagement here at TAMIU. And welcome to the second of the 2021-2022 International Leadership Series. This year, our focus is on dignity and justice, fulfilling the human rights promise. This event is also the last event as we close down the celebration of Hispanic Heritage Month here at TAMIU. And we are super excited that you all were able to join us here in person as well as online. The International Leadership Series focuses in on the 7 elements of global citizenship as defined by Oxfam. And these 7 elements, we hope our students, as they graduate from TAMIU, will be able to utilize throughout the rest of their lives. We focused on, a few years ago, sustainable development. Last year, our topic was social justice and equity. This year, it's human rights. We'll focus on peace and conflict, identity and diversity, power and governance, and globalization and interdependence as we move forward throughout our years here. That's what makes this unique. The International Leadership Series is one of TAMIU's premier leadership programs that we have here. And our students are able to become, you in attendance here, are able to become International Leadership Fellows. And the International Leadership Fellows students have to attend 5 of the 6 International Leadership Series and complete prompts that you'll have available on Blackboard. You'll also participate in the Art for Social Change competition in spring 2022, where you have a chance to win money. You are also honored and celebrated at the Emerging Leaders Celebration, as well as receiving a medal, the International Leaders Medal, at the end of the year. Once again, this is one of the more prestigious leadership programs that we have here at TAMIU. And so our topic this year is human rights. And human rights are rights that we have simply because we exist as human beings. They are not granted by any state, right? They are just who we are, just by existing as humans. And so there are three components of human rights. They are universal and inalienable. We are all equally treated and entitled to human rights, and they should not be taken away unless it's through due process. Right? And so I think we're just a little behind there on the PowerPoint, sorry. And so another aspect is that they're indivisible and interdependent. One set of rights cannot be enjoyed fully without the other set of rights, right? So we can make progress in civil and political rights in order to exercise our economic, social, and cultural rights. They all go hand in hand. All of these rights go hand in hand. And so we want you to be aware of different topics throughout the presentations that we have here. The last component of human rights is that they are equal and non-discriminatory, meaning that we are all born free and equal in dignity and rights, and that we should not be discriminated against, and we should have freedom from discrimination, and that ensures our equality amongst all other humans here on the earth. And so as we continue today into this International Leadership Series, our focus and topic is really the intersectionality of set of rights that we have as individuals, right? So, and really Heritage Month that we're celebrating this month. And so we close down Hispanic or Latinx Heritage Month, and then we start celebrating LGBT Heritage Month as well. And so we are focusing in on LGBTQ plus human rights in Latin America today. And we are pleased to have with us Dr. Aron Alejandro Olivas, who is an associate professor of history here at TAMIU. He earned his PhD from the University of California, Los Angeles, and his Master's of Arts from the University of Chicago. And we are extremely fortunate to actually have him here to be able to explain to us a little bit about his background and a little bit about his research, as he is a specialist in the socio-political culture of the Iberian Atlantic world and Latin America, in particular, trans-imperial relations and the integration of Spanish colonial subjects into the politics of early modern European empires. His current book project analyzes the transition from Habsburg to Bourbon dynastic rule in the viceroyalties of New Spain and Peru during the War of Spanish Succession. His research reveals the role of French cloth merchants, ministers of state, and slave traders in consolidating the Bourbon sovereignty in Spanish America and combating the dynasty's enemies in the Americas and Europe through the asiento, which is colonial slave monopoly. He's published several articles on Latin America's role in early modern global wars, the transatlantic slave trade, political resistance in 18th century Manila, Spanish colonial spectacles during the early Bourbon period, and European theatrical representations of the conquest of Mexico. Like his research, his teaching focuses on the history of the broader Hispanic world, both in Latin America and Spain. And so if you wouldn't mind giving a round of applause and welcome, warm dust of a welcome for Dr. Aron Olivas. Excuse me.
Good morning. Thank you guys for attending. And I want to thank the Seoul office as well, and Dr. Hudson and all of the students at the Seoul office for putting on all of these events. We have a lot of different entities here on campus that want us to make Hispanic Heritage Month as special as possible, and I have to give them extra credit for going and creating all of these student-centered events that are so wonderful every year. So thank you so much. As I go into this talk, I guess I should warn you. I mean, you just heard my bio. It's pretty heavy in terms of what I do as a historian. So I guess as a little warning today, you should know that you're going to be getting a history lesson because you've invited a historian here today to talk to you about LGBTQ plus human rights. So bear with me. Though I think the biggest lessons we can take away from this is as what I would like to propose, the idea of decolonizing our perspectives, especially relevant this year. The year 2021 for most Latin American countries is the bicentennial of independence. But yet, 200 years later, how much attitudes in Latin America, right, are still flavored by unfortunate legacies of colonialism. So hopefully this talk today and looking at this history and heritage will remind us of the needs to decolonize our perspectives. As well, I want to, in kind of giving you an overview of LGBTQ plus history in Latin America, hit upon the notion of the cyclical nature of history, or most especially Latin American history. We often talk about change and continuity, for better or for worse, over the course of Latin American history. And most certainly we see this very plainly in LGBTQ plus history in Latin America. A cyclical nature in terms of supports and attacks against that community historically. And so I hope as well, by reflecting upon this history, that all of us will walk away as better allies or advocates for actually learning that history. So let's jump into this. I sort of organized this lecture in terms of like standard ways of looking at Latin American history based on periods. So I wanted to give us an introduction to that period, that history during the pre-Hispanic period, and then speak about what happened under colonialism, and then take us up into the modern and the contemporary period, where a lot of work obviously still needs to be done. Now, if we spoke about LGBTQ plus during the pre-Hispanic period, it's a period of very broad gender fluidity and a period in which homosexuality was very commonplace in virtually every single indigenous community on this continent, according to anthropologists and historians alike. In terms of communities that were most sexually diverse or sex positive, we would have the Toltecs, for example, of central Mexico, arguably the most tolerant of homosexuality, or as well Mayas, Zapotecs, and Mixtecs in central and southern Mexico, where homosexuality was at least common, or if not tolerated by the majority of people in their societies. We even have in the case of the Nahuas, formerly known as the Aztecs, who put a particular value on individuals known as the Patleche, who were women within their society that carried out what were traditionally masculine activities within Nahua society. But this inclusivity was not only on the social level. Something that's also present in the pre-Hispanic period is for these worldviews to be reflected in virtually all pre-Hispanic religious practices. And a classic example of this would be in Mesoamerica, amongst the Nahuas and the Toltecs, the deity Xochipilli, who was translated in Nahuatl to flower prince, who was a queer deity for Mesoamericans. And you could see a statue of him on the PowerPoint slide. The Nahuas had gods representing different aspects of life, and Xochipilli was a god who was venerated to celebrate human pleasure, physical pleasure and joy as an intimate and important part of being healthy, mental human being. So certainly a very sex-positive religion. But another common belief as well included trans people having specific and special roles within pre-Hispanic society. And virtually all indigenous communities viewed trans people as being highly spiritual and having spiritual powers. In which case, most trans people served as shamans in most indigenous communities. Not only in Mesoamerica, but even including in South America, the Tirahuena of the Varao people of Venezuela, or further in the southern cone, amongst the Mapuches, where we find like modern-day Argentina and Chile. And you can still find these individuals acting as shamans still to this day. The umbrella term amongst indigenous communities for what we would call trans individuals is the terms two-spirit, or dos espíritus, is more commonly used now to speak about these individuals. That not only represents their temporal and human manifestation, but also their spiritual aspect within their communities. Just a little bit of history, by the way, about the term two-spirit, which originally exists in English and now is being used more commonly in Spanish as dos espíritus. It was created by indigenous peoples themselves at the Indigenous Lesbian and Gay Conference held in Winnipeg, Canada in 1990. So contemporary Indigenous peoples looking for a vocabulary to better explain this pan-Indigenous phenomenon. Now, these worldviews that I just described are largely going to be endangered and challenged by European colonialism. By the way, not just Spanish colonialism, but also English, French, and Dutch colonialism. But nonetheless, these beliefs and practices will survive in Latin America, largely through clandestine practices, moving it into the private sphere, or through conscious revival of aspects that have survived over time and making them more public, which has been a more recent phenomenon. Now, to kind of throw this into the category of these pre-Hispanic traditions, I think the most prominent example of this that we find in Latin America would be the Muxe community of Oaxaca. So they're indigenous Zapotecs who call themselves Muxes. It's significant that this comes from Oaxaca, by the way, because Oaxaca is Mexico's largest and most diverse indigenous population. And also, interestingly, it's the oldest surviving urban culture in all of the Americas. One of the first cultures in the Americas to develop writing. So a lot of continuity and pride for their culture, intellectual, social, and political. But these Muxe who live in Oaxaca are seen as a third gender and have been seen as such since pre-Hispanic times. And if we were going to come up with a general definition for the Muxes, we would describe them as people assigned as male at birth, but who adopt identities associated with women. And it's a pretty large community in Oaxaca. It's estimated about 6% of the population assigned as male at birth in the state of Oaxaca are identifying as Muxes. So about 3,000 of these Muxes. They're often encouraged to embrace this identity by their mothers. Oaxaca's not totally matriarchal, but it has a lot of matriarchal tendencies. And so it's often the role of the mothers to encourage their sons if they seem to be generically exhibiting signs of effeminate behavior to identify and to continue the traditions expected of Muxes. Now, we can sometimes also think of Muxes as being gendered fluid. It's a reminder about how these don't always fit perfectly into Western categories, even though on a more complex level we could call this a trans identity, right? But with spiritual properties. For example, Muxes often consider themselves male or female, depending on the moment that they find themselves in their everyday lives. For example, a Muxe might date a transgender man while dressed as a woman, but also take on male roles within the society as well, or not always dress in traditional female clothing. But their roles also go back to pre-Hispanic times and tend to be pre-Hispanic women's roles within society and within family that's expected of these individuals based off of Zapotec customs. For example, they'll be expected to cook for the family or the community, or serve as important caretakers for children or the elderly, or to work producing culture. And especially recently, they've been known as important harbingers of fashion and even hairdressing within Zapotec society. And most especially embroidery. They've been the most important proponents of continuing to preserve traditional Zapotec garments and Zapotec weaving, and also to preserve Zapotec dances within their community. Oh, by the way, in terms of food, I don't know if you guys seen like the Taco Chronicles. It's a really great Netflix series. There's a Muxe now who's taken this tradition to Mexico City, and she actually sells tacos on the streets of Mexico City wearing her traditional clothes, or at least as best as she can. She calls her roving taco stand Lady Tacos de Canasta, but she's known as Marvin La Muxe. That is when she's not being harassed by the police, right, in Mexico City. But in Oaxaca, right, their traditional roles include maintaining Zapotec culture, or even like the notion of the quinceañera as an important rite of passage in Oaxaca. This is something that's often curated and planned by Muxes within their society. Or spring festivals known as velas, which are very common in Oaxaca. The vela is kind of interesting. It's quasi-religious, quasi-social. It's usually for the patron saint, the Catholic patron saint of the town. She usually usurped an indigenous deity that was originally there, but also a social event for people within the community to reinforce bonds, and dance, and eat good food, and do community works. They also include like a crowning of a queen, usually. There's approximately 25 of these every spring within Oaxaca, and Muxes are considered, again, important individuals who keep this tradition alive and are there to preserve the culture. Muxes themselves also have their own specific vela now, at least since the 1970s. That's only specifically for like Muxes, known as the Vela de las Auténticas Intrépidas Buscadores del Peligro, which in fact there's a documentary on it if you're interested in this specific Muxe-centric event. But otherwise, right, they're fully incorporated into the general velas that are held throughout Oaxaca. Although the Muxes are prized and defended by indigenous Zapotecs, they're often harassed by the Hispanic or mestizo population, who tend to be representative in terms of like the government and the police force in Oaxaca. So they're interesting in terms of the Zapotec community coming to their defense, versus other ideas and cultures that have since come into Oaxaca. Over time as well, we've seen as a result of migration, this pre-Hispanic indigenous tradition also spread elsewhere. And now in the 21st century, we can commonly see it intersecting with LGBTQ plus communities in other parts of Mexico, like Mexico City, or even in the United States, as more and more Oaxacans have immigrated into places like California. And so as recently as the 2010s, we're now starting to see Muxe velas being held in places like Mexico City or in Los Angeles. Or for this identity and its customs and even its language to now cause a lot of trans people of Mexican descent who aren't Zapotec to be drawn to this community in order to help better define themselves. So that's just kind of a glimpse at the pre-Hispanic period, thousands of years and thousands of cultures, right? We only have so much time, but a nice kind of glimpse at it, including some of its continuities. Most of the issues that we deal with still today in terms of the LGBTQ plus community in Latin America have to do with the colonial period and its legacies. And for Latin America, that would last from 1492 up into the 1820s. And this is the period in which we're going to see the introduction of the Western gender binary introduced into Latin America, with other trappings and problems of that, including, for example, the notion of homosexuality as being morally corrupt or sinful, the idea of pecado, right, being brought from Spain. At the same time, colonialism will propagate the active-passive dichotomy, as it's sometimes called, in terms of sexual relations, or this notion of same-sex penetration being problematic, whether it's man and man or woman and woman. Within this dichotomy, coming from this colonial period, is generally seen in Latin America that the person that's stigmatized the most is the individual who is penetrated in their private sexual relations. They tend to be judged more harshly, although sometimes, right, both parties might also be judged within a community. This strange phenomenon still exists today in many places, for example, where Latin American men, who we might call the active sex partner, do not see themselves as gay, that they only see a person who is penetrated as being gay. And then, as a result, they tend to stigmatize the person who might take up what we would call the passive role. The colonial period also gives us a lexicon of hate besides all of these weird conventions about gender norms. It gives us a lexicon of hate in terms of giving us vocabulary words, such as, forgive my use of these terms, maricon and marimacho, to refer to the LGBTQ plus community, especially gays and queers or lesbians. And believe it or not, these are slurs that were already used as early as the 16th century. And even in my own research, I've seen these come up in documents, legal documents and Inquisition cases. There's been attempts to undo the damage of these words in recent times, including in 2013, the Mexican Supreme Court actually ruled that the word maricon is not protected by freedom of expression in the Constitution, and that people, if they choose, can actually pursue and sue someone who's used that term. Sometimes easier said than done, right, in terms of proving this in court of law or making your gender identity public, maybe in a very judgmental community. But nonetheless, at least in terms of law, there have been attempts to change this in places like Mexico to remove this from the Mexican vocabulary. Something notable during the colonial period, if this also gets us to attempt to decolonize our views of gender identity, it would be the historical use of indigenous sexual diversity to actually justify the Spanish conquest. If you read closely narratives of the Spanish conquest, this is a common theme that actually comes up in the writings of conquistadors. As early as the conquest of the Caribbean and the Central America, like Panama in the 1510s, this was something that was often thrown around by conquistadors to justify their acts of violence and their usurping of these territories from indigenous communities. Another classic case would be Hernan Cortez's letters himself. If you read Mexican history, the letters that Hernan Cortez wrote to Emperor Charles V to justify what he was doing, there's many passages that speak to Mexica sodomy, quote unquote, or cross-dressing as sins, as abominations, that in Cortez's eyes justified any of the actions then that he was imposing upon those communities of Mexico. I also have to bring up Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, which I think most Texans read. He was the failed conquistador who had to walk from Florida through Texas and northern Mexico down to Mexico City. He's often let off the hook just because he didn't kill a bunch of people along the way. I mean, he was kind of enslaved along the way by different communities. But nonetheless, if we look at his writings, we can also see him being very judgmental and critical of what he saw as gender diversity, trans and queer people, we would call today amongst the indigenous societies of the Mexico borderland. Again, for some reason, he's always let off the hook when people read him here in Texas as like the good conquistador. But look into, right closely into his readings, and we can see these terrible colonial attitudes still present very clearly in his work. Also, in terms of like critiquing the problems of colonialism, especially its connection to broader world history, we should think about this in terms of complicating the legacies of individuals, intellectuals like Francisco de Vitoria and Bartolomé de las Casas. Maybe you're more familiar with Bartolomé de las Casas. But both Vitoria and Las Casas are sometimes called by people in the Western world as the fathers of modern human rights. I don't know if you've heard this, since they were amongst the first Western voices to defend indigenous communities as human within their different writings. But nonetheless, I would offer the critique that if we look close enough at their writings, you notice that they actually drew the line in a very conspicuous place. And this is when it came to gender diversity or homosexuality as they understood it in the Americas. And although the writings of Las Casas and Vitoria said indigenous people deserved sort of proto-human rights, they also very clearly say, well, also their sexual diversity needed to be stopped by force, in effect then justifying aspects of violence against these communities through colonialism. We definitely see this engendered during the spiritual conquest, the evangelization of native peoples by Spanish friars, their forced conversion throughout all of the Americas, where it was very common for sexual diversity or homosexuality to be punished by friars through mechanisms such as public humiliation in front of the crowd, or public flogging, or even exile from the community, or in the most extreme cases, hanging or burning individuals at the stake. And one of the earliest cases we have of this, for example, in colonial Mexico, would be the execution of Nahuas for homosexuality as early as the year 1530. Outside the indigenous community as well, there's also sexual diversity, right? This isn't to say that this is just something indicative of indigenous communities. Most certainly other colonial communities of Hispanic, Black, and Mestizo descent also expressed this all throughout the colonial period. But nonetheless, this was also policed by the Spanish colonial administration, usually through the form of the Inquisition. In case you're unfamiliar with the Inquisition, it was a legal tribunal run by Dominican friars who could issue sentences against crimes that would then be carried out by secular authorities. Sort of a marriage of church and crown in terms of punishing different crimes within the society. The Inquisition had similar punishments for Hispanics, Blacks, and Mestizos when it came to sexual diversity and its expression, including like public humiliation again, which then stigmatized you in terms of the public, also flogging, or in certain cases as well, execution of these individuals. One of the most infamous examples of this would be in Mexico City between the years 1657 and 1658, the denouncement of 125 male sodomites throughout the city, which led to 19 being found guilty of what was called at the time el pecado nefando, or homosexual relations. At the end of the day, 14 of these individuals we burned at the stake, while 5 of them, who were younger, and so the judge supposedly had a little bit more clemency with them, were punished to 200 lashes in the Plaza Mayor and then forced labor for 6 years, which is also kind of a common theme in Latin American history. Like, forced labor is supposed to correct homosexuality by somehow making the individual more masculine at the end of the day. But this event in Mexico City, this infamous event, is probably the most bloody and most brutal when it came to the persecution in the colonial period of the LGBTQ plus community. It's an early example of the community being used as scapegoats, especially in times of pressure. That oftentimes when there's times of chaos or seemingly a lack of control, societies will look for the marginalized and take out their frustrations on them. And this seems to be an early example of this in Latin American history. Now, rather than just exiling all of them or flogging all of them, it seemed as though this sentence of execution came at a specific time in which there was political crisis in the Spanish Empire. At that time, the English were encroaching into the Caribbean and doing things like conquering Jamaica and harassing the coasts of Mexico. And so because society was already under intense paranoia, colonial administrators and the general public thought it was appropriate to lash out again at these men who we would call queer or gay during this particular time period. Nonetheless, something really interesting about the colonial period as well, though, it offers us some exceptional cases of individuals that when we look back at LGBTQ plus history have now become icons or generally accepted and admired by Latin Americans for the expressions of their gender identity. One of the most famous of these would be Catalina de Arauzo, who lived from 1585 to 1650, and she's in the middle of the slide if you want to see her portrait. She's also referred to as the Basque Lieutenant Nun. And in terms of her gender identity, originally she was referred to as lesbian by scholars in the 20th century, but now in the 21st century, most argue she's more appropriately referred to as transgender. But she was assigned woman at birth. Her family threw her in a convent as a teenager. She figured out convent life wasn't for her. She escaped and she ran off to Peru dressed as a man. And went about living her life as a man in colonial Peru, trying to seek her fortune in the rough and tumble mining camps of the Andes. And in the process, even giving in tavern brawls, protecting the honor of women who were being sexually assaulted and harassed by miners in the camps. Eventually, over time, she will join a Spanish colonial militia and serve to fight against English and Dutch pirates that were trying to enter and pillage the Spanish Empire. And it's in the process of being in the militia that her identity will be discovered and she will be turned over to the Inquisition for prosecution. But at the end of the day, she's actually not punished, although she has to go through a lot of humiliating acts as the Inquisition is now inspecting this trans woman, including, for example, stripping her naked and inspecting her genitals to see whether or not she had been penetrated. Again, a classic colonial preoccupation with the bodies of the LGBTQ plus community. Nonetheless, going through this humiliation and this prosecution, she will actually be let free. The church and the crown both decided that, in fact, she could continue living as a man. And the crown even issued a royal decree saying that she was now a man and she would be protected with that identity as long as she lived. From there, by the way, she leaves Peru and she goes to Mexico, and she lives the rest of her life as a muleteer, someone that was in charge of these cargo mules that would take people to and from Veracruz and Mexico City. What just happened right now, by the way, I mean, this should have been a head scratcher in terms of the outcome of Catalina de Orozco. Well, scholars have argued that because Catalina supported rather than challenged the project of empire, this made her acceptable to church and crown, and exceptionally so. I guess she was so good at being a pirate fighter that she was allowed to keep this identity. Which again reminds us of the weird contradictions of colonialism, that she was allowed to do so. But because of this, right now she is seen as a hero of Latin American history and an icon for the LGBTQ plus community. Another exceptional case in an overlapping time period is Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, who lived in Mexico City from 1648 to 1695. Arguably the smartest person in all of Mexican history, if you ever read any of her writings. She was an intellectual and a nun who used her privilege to attack machismo and the marginalization of women in colonial Mexico. Most famously through things like poetry, her poem Hombres Necios, which talks about the problem of the double standard between men and women in Mexico, and also her letter to Sor Filotea, supposedly written to another nun, in which she argued that women deserved an education and they deserved to be respected within society. It's in that letter as well, by the way, that she admits to wanting to cross-dress in order to get an education. At the time, you had to be a man to get enrolled in the University of Mexico, the forerunner of UNAM. And so she admits in the letter wanting to get an education. She showed up to her mom one day dressed in a boy's clothes, saying she's ready to go to the registrar's office, right, and get enrolled as a student. The mom sent her back. Her writings over time were banned by the Archbishop of Mexico for pushing the envelope a little bit too far in criticizing gender norms. But her works will actually live in the public sphere. Although the Archbishop gets her to stop writing, what she had already written will remain continuously read by people in Latin America, still up to the present, or still rolling off the press, even though she had been effectively silenced. In terms of her gender identity, we're not quite sure. There have been scholars, especially in the 20th century and beyond, who have been tempted to interpret her and view her as lesbian, though it's debatable. We know that there's a lot of strong homosocial bonds and homosocial language in her writing, but it's hard to say whether we could actually categorize her as being homosexual. But regardless, her attacks against toxic masculinity, especially in the colonial period where it would seem like the deck is stacked against her, right, has caused her to be embraced by the LGBTQ community to this day. And there's even, by the way, a LGBTQ plus organization in Mexico City named in her honor, El Closet de Sor Juana, as now she's seen, right? This idea of attacking toxic masculinity, obviously something as well that the LGBTQ plus community can relate to. This takes us now to the modern period in which change has been far slower than we should think of as being acceptable, especially the post-independence period in the 19th century. Very little seemed to change in terms of these gender norms and these problematic legacies of colonialism. Although by the late 19th century, we're going to see a lot of liberal governments in Latin America decriminalize same-sex practices, sexual practices in private. This didn't mean that laws weren't also continuing to be stacked against the community. But to kind of give us an example of this, like Benito Juarez in Mexico will, again, decriminalize same-sex sexual acts in private in 1871. But nonetheless, this didn't mean that lawyers still didn't come along and judges and devise new laws that say broadly defined public immorality and indecency in legal codes that could still be used then to prosecute people who identified as queer or lesbian at the time. I guess the main issue here is especially it being in public as being something the society still wants to hide behind the curtain or behind closed doors. By the way, in terms of Benito Juarez coming up with attempts to decriminalize these acts, over time, he's also been seen as a character or a figure within Latin American history that's been embraced by the LGBTQ plus community. He most famously, at least in terms of like a response to European imperialism, came up with the phrase, respeto para el derecho ajeno es la paz, or peace means respect for the rights of others, which is a broad phrase to refer to the need to, again, for communities to respect people who are even different from each other. And so over time, this has especially been a motto that's been used by the LGBTQ plus community in Mexico to bring awareness for the need of people to give them respect. And I've showed an image on the screen. You can even see this couple getting married in Mexico holding up this image of Benito Juarez and that quote, and using it to apply more broadly to social issues and not just politics. But nonetheless, right, in the modern period, there was still a distaste for this idea of these identities to be expressed publicly, although somehow people seem to be okay with this being behind closed doors and hush-hush. Most infamously, this would cause the persecution of 41 individuals in Mexico in November of 1901 during an event known as the Dance of the 41, during the dictatorship of the Porfiriato. It's an interesting event because it became a cause célèbre, or like a major tabloid story at the time. And in fact, the intellectual Carlos Monsiváis refers to the Dance of the 41 as the first time that homosexuality was discussed openly in the modern Latin America media. This event was a dance, innocent enough, attended by 41 men, in which 22 of them were dressed in men's clothing, and 19 were dressed in women's clothing from the period. And this dance will be raided by the police. Interestingly enough, in terms of the social status of the people at the event, most of them came from the middle class or the bourgeoisie in Mexico at the time. Because of this, because they came from good families, quote unquote, families that were ashamed of this event and later treated them as pariahs, their names were kept out of the press, but at least the story was leaked, and it will become this major event in terms of the consciousness of the presence of the LGBTQ plus community in modern Mexico. In the end, by the way, all 41 will be sentenced to military duty in the Yucatan, where the military at the time was trying to basically enslave the Maya population and put down an uprising. The 41 men will be sent to Quintana Roo and forced to do hard labor for the army. And again, this notion of labor being proper correction, quote unquote, for these types of gender identities. If we actually start to see a glimmer of hope in the 20th century, it's going to come through the wave of social revolutions that start to begin at the beginning of the century and catch on by the middle of the century. The most famous of these, like the first social revolution in world history, the Mexican Revolution, gives us some examples of this. The Mexican Revolution lasts from 1910 to 1917. It was a push for socioeconomic change that for many as well was seen as an opportunity to bring gender equality as well. Obviously revolutions have people who are fighting for different reasons, right? But it seems to have attracted a lot, as we see in current research, people who saw this as an opportunity to overthrow colonial gender norms. Most famous of these individuals would be Amelio Robles Avila, who lived from 1889 to 1984, lived a long time, from the state of Guerrero. Amelio Robles Avila was assigned male at birth, but by the time he reached his 20s, began to identify as a man, just about as the time that the Mexican Revolution was breaking out. And seeing the cries for equality as something that Amelio could identify with and something that was worth fighting for, he will quickly join the revolution in 1910 and fight for the duration of the conflict as a combatant, actually dressed as a man, and will be so valued by the revolutionaries, at least by the Zapatistas, that he will eventually rise to the rank of colonel. And after the revolution, continue to live as a man, recognized by the local community as such until his death at the age of 95. Also quickly after the revolution, and for the rest, I guess, of his life, Amelio was also quick to threaten to shoot anyone who tried to call him a female, and seemed to get away with this and had the support of the community. And there's an example even of two men who tried to sexually assault him, tried to remove his clothes. He ended up shooting them and was let go by the judge and respected as being able to then express his gender identity in his community. Amelio was also deeply entrenched in the cause of the revolution. So it's also interesting that once the revolution ended, Venustiano Carranza became president and didn't seem to want to enforce the Constitution of 1917, which did have certain mechanisms of gender equality. Amelio will join Álvaro Obregón in overthrowing that government and forcing the Mexican state to go more firmly to the left and push for greater equality, or true social equality. There seemed to be hope for this in Mexico in the wake of the revolution. And shoot, right, it seems like a society that would allow someone like Amelio to go around and express his gender identity as he chose. The 1920s to the 1940s were sort of a heyday for experimentations with pushing the limits and raising these conversations. We start to see the first gay bars as well in Mexico City during this time period. Or, for example, intellectuals like Frida Kahlo, the famous artist, surrealist artist, openly express her identity as bisexual during this time period. Part of many facets of her personality that seemed nonconformist to traditions that had taken bed in Mexico because of colonialism. Her bisexual identity, by the way, has also made her an icon for the LGBTQ plus community, though there's still a lot of Mexicans who are uncomfortable talking about that. They actually hide that part of her identity, though before the 1950s, it was commonly known that this was how she identified. It actually made Diego Rivera uncomfortable at times. But nonetheless, right, for reasons post-1950, this tends to be hidden and downplayed and ignored. That's indicative of what will happen in places like Mexico from the 1950s to the end of the 20th century, especially to the 1990s, where revolutionary calls for social equality beginning in 1910 tend to be superseded by centrist and leftist ideologies, or by neoliberalism being more the concern of governments, making Latin America fully integrated into the global economy and capitalist, rather than sitting back and continuing to do the work to bring equality in all forms, right, including gender equality. Because of this pause button being set, we don't really see most of the progress within Latin America until the last 10 years, if you can believe it or not. Although people still kept fighting during the end of the 20th century. This was especially part of the Latinx diaspora, partly in the United States, seeing things like the Stonewall riots going on and bringing these ideas down to Mexico, leading, for example, in 1971 to the Frente de Liberación Homosexual, which was the first LGBTQ plus activist group in Latin America, with the original intent, by the way, for fair labor. They were trying to protest in the spirit of neoliberalism at the time, LGBTQ plus employees being denied labor or fired because of their identity. This also will lead to the first pride marches in Latin America, including in Mexico City in 1979, which also spreads to the Southern Cone, and more recently in places like Guadalajara by 1996. The main issues that have changed in terms of our contemporary history have to do with marriage equality, legal gender recognition, and legal joint adoption, being the main issues that are still works in progress, but nonetheless have made major strides over the past 10 years. Let's talk about marriage equality, or as it's called in Spanish, matrimonio igualitario. First nation in the Western Hemisphere, the first nation in Latin America to adapt matrimonio igualitario will be Argentina in the year 2010, which is interesting. It's only the 10th nation on the planet to actually allow for equal marriage. I almost said the first in the Americas. Canada was actually the first, so pardon my slip of the tongue. Canada legalized equal marriage in 2005, and so Argentina came along in 2010 and was the second. The United States won't do so until 2015, just to jog your memory. But after this happened in Argentina, we will also see equal marriage in places like Brazil and Uruguay by 2013, Colombia in 2016, 1 year after the United States, Ecuador and Mexico by 2019, and then Costa Rica by 2020. And it seems like the next country that has this in the works is going to be Chile, where conversations and debates have been put in place since 2017. But because of economic woes and as well the COVID pandemic, the pause button has quickly been put on this process in Chile. Chile allows for civil unions like Bolivia, by the way, but nonetheless does not offer marriage equality. Just kind of a side note to explain the case of Mexico, by the way, if you're familiar with Mexican politics. Mexico will have a very federalist response to this. In Mexico, there's a lot of states' rights that supersede the rights of the central government. But nonetheless, it will be the decision of the Mexican Supreme Court in 2019 that states had the right to legalize equal marriage. And if a state legalized it, it needed to be recognized in all of the other states. So if you got married in a state where it was legal and were a resident in a state where it was not legal, the local officials there still need to recognize that marriage as legal. If that makes sense, the crazy way federalism works in Mexico. This means that Mexico City and 20 states within the Mexican Republic then have legalized equal marriage. And again, if you're a resident then in a state where it hasn't been legalized, it has to now be observed by the local authorities. By the way, the closest states that have legalized it, at least to us here in Laredo, would be Coahuila very early on in 2014, before the Supreme Court decision, and Nuevo León in 2019, so shortly after the Supreme Court decision. But not in Tamaulipas. Something should be done about that. This probably shows us as well, like changing climate in Mexico, these decisions, besides, right, sometimes it's just merely the decisions of administrators. At least according to a current Pew Research Center opinion survey in Mexico, at least 69% of Mexicans believe that the LGBTQ plus community deserves equal protections, which, by the way, is up from 61% in 2013. Still needs to be higher, but nonetheless, showing us some progressive change over time. I'd also mentioned legal gender recognition as one of these important issues that's still being fought for. In Argentina, much as once is also at the forefront of legalizing equal marriage, was at the forefront of doing this as well. In 2012, Argentina was the first to allow transgender individuals to legally change their name and gender without any conditions. And since then, there's been similar legislation in Brazil, Colombia, Costa Rica, Ecuador, certain states in Mexico, and also Uruguay since 2015. Joint legal adoption has been something that's been more controversial in Latin America. We only find it in places like Uruguay, Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, and Costa Rica between 2009 and 2020, but also seems to be, again, kind of compared to these other issues, something that there's been more sort of paused. But more recently, and maybe a reminder of sort of these cycles of support and attacks, have been sweeping milestones that have happened very recently in 2018, in which the Inter-American Court of Human Rights has now intervened to try to standardize and normalize LGBTQ rights, broadly speaking, around Latin America. By the way, this Inter-American Court of Human Rights applies to 24 member countries that are part of something known as the American Convention of Human Rights, which was founded in 1969. But the main ruling in 2018 to try to standardize it for all of these Latin American countries, at least these 24 members, included number one, obligating members to ensure equal marriage rights as a basic human right. Number two, obligating these members to legalize change of name and rectification of public records and identity documents to conform to a person's actual gender identity. And then last but not least, obligating the members to extend equal protections to all of the LGBTQ community under law. The result of this, by the way, this sweeping ruling, came because the Costa Rican government in 2016 actually asked the Inter-American Court of Human Rights to jump on this issue, to try to interpret the scope of rights to privacy, right to name, right to equal protections under law, especially because there was no standardized sentiment of this across Latin America, right? Too many variations of laws and variations of discrimination. Now, although this ruling was very sweeping, I'm again going to remind you of how often the pause button is often placed on the history of the LGBTQ community. Although this wave and this progress caused a lot of euphoria amongst the community, at least by 2021, only 2 countries have formally and directly complied with the IACHR ruling, and these would be the countries of Costa Rica and Ecuador. If this wave is under threat of being put on pause yet again, this long history, what seem to be the main threats or the main reasons for this? There really seem to be 2 major factors that now put a lot of this change in jeopardy. The first would be backlash from social and religious conservatives in Latin America who are very strongly opposed to these ideas. Part of these attitudes are social, by the way, like classic machismo, toxic masculinity getting in the way of this. But also religion is often used as a pretext, especially amongst right-wing Catholics, but also right-wing Protestants throughout Latin America, the growing evangelical and Jehovah's Witness population who tend to identify politically as being on the right and see this as an agenda in which they are eager to push. Combination of this then tends to play itself out politically, especially now that we've entered the 21st century. We see many Latin American politicians in the center and to the right actively attempt to get the support of voters who are hostile to LGBTQ plus rights and seek them, right, as their voting base, and then promise to put these laws on hold or make laws even worse and more harsh for the community. In terms of the regions of Latin America where this has been the strongest, we have, for example, Central America, the Caribbean, and now Brazil, which have now begun to swing to the right. And regions now that, amongst all the parts of Latin America, are where we find communities that are most hostile to LGBTQ plus rights. Take, for example, recently in Guatemala, where a congressional commission is now seeking to remove the country's I can never pronounce this, ombudsman, right, advocate or arbitrator for human rights, because this arbitrator vocally and publicly made statements supporting LGBTQ rights and abortion as well. Also in El Salvador, the current president, despite an earlier pledge to be on the right side of history when it came to LGBTQ rights, now opposes marriage equality and has discontinued the government's sexual diversity work, again, mostly to cater votes from people socially and religiously on the right. Also Honduras, very recently in 2021, the military dictatorship has approved a constitutional amendment that would require 3/4 majority to overturn the country's existing ban on marriage equality and abortion. By the way, it shouldn't be a surprise then, seeing especially how harsh these attitudes have been in the Caribbean and Central America, that these have been the places in Latin America where we've seen the most migration trying to come to the United States, right? A surge of LGBTQ plus asylum seekers coming to the U.S. border, coming to the U.S. Soil to actually be able to express themselves and live without being discriminated or being threatened by violence. Nonetheless, it was the recent agenda of the Trump administration to purposely try to block these asylum seekers, people specifically from the LGBTQ plus community. And although this has been slightly loosened under the present administration, there's a lot of people who still consider this to be put on pause and to put these individuals in jeopardy. Oh, I'd also mentioned Brazil, by the way, where the current president, Bolsonaro, is also purposely fueling social divisions using classic homophobic slurs and rhetoric to try and steer up people's passions and gain support for his administration. We know, besides being himself personally a homophobe in public, that he's also using his power in terms of appointing judges throughout Brazil that have similar opinions, who many are concerned now might undermine all of the progressive laws that have been, achieved in Brazil since the 2010s. And then the second major factor, again, this idea of major crises causing the LGBTQ plus community to become scapegoats. This has totally been happening during the COVID-19 pandemic, where social and economic crisis causes people to lash out specifically on people that they think are powerless and think are marginalized. This is significant for Latin America because, globally speaking, 1/3 of all COVID deaths worldwide happen to be Latin American. And the pandemic has done nothing but intensify the stigmatization of the community, even bringing back homophobia from the AIDS pandemic days of the 80s and the 90s. But most especially, we've seen countries that have attempted to do things like impose gender curfews to limit people's presence in the public. Countries like Peru, Panama, and Colombia enacted such laws to combat the spread, but has actually led to violence against the LGBTQ community. These curfews based on gender allowed women and men to leave their dwellings on alternate days of the week. But when it came to, say, trans people, going out in public on days that they identified, right, with the gender for that day, it has led to discrimination and even violence, including, for example, these individuals being turned away at stores and not being allowed to buy essential goods on those days, or these individuals being fined, arrested, or even beaten by the police for going out on those specific days. So that is my spiel, more or less. I've taken us across thousands of years of Latin American history. I hope this makes us better advocates and better allies as we leave today. And remember, as much as we can gain over time, these things can be quickly lost. And so to be conscious and aware of the histories, the legacies of this, the need to decolonize our worldviews, and the need to, I guess, strike the hand that pushes the pause button, to be active in the role of combating these attitudes and being good support for the community. All right? Thank you so much.
Just want to once again say thank you to Dr. Olivas for coming in and speaking to us about this fascinating history, through thousands of years here in Latin America. This will conclude our second International Leadership Series for today. If you do have questions, hopefully we'll be able to get to them, but I know that we've ran over time, and so we'll be able to have Dr. Olivas answer questions, but for those that need to go, thank you all for coming. We'll be having our third series on November 19th, right before the Thanksgiving holiday. All right, thank you all very much, and have a great rest of your day.
Yeah. Thanks for staying. I forgot to warn you, historians are long-winded. So I appreciate your attention. Thanks. It was hard to figure out what to include and not include.
Are we on live streaming? Yeah. Okay, great. Hey, Dr. Hello.